I think when you look at young children, there's a place where they flourish, irrespective of some of the trauma and some of the experiences that they have in their lives. There are certain places that actually just help them to be calm. There are places that seem to connect to them in an unobservable kind of way. And I would suggest that's the natural world. So that means that when we start to look at a rights-based agenda, children have a right to be with the natural world and in it and with it and for as long as we can actually help them to have access to it. So that means that really it comes back to when it's a young baby, how far is that baby from a human heartbeat? Because for me, we are all part of the natural world. It's an ecosystem. We need to be more ecocentric in what we do as opposed to egocentric. And one of those things, I suppose, is that when you start to see that we're all part of nature, then it's the heartbeat. It's the food we eat, it's the water that we drink, it's the air that we breathe. And so from that very early stage, right the way through until you die, basically, you're in this integrated, entwined journey with children and as a human being with the natural world. So it means that really, when you look at the rights-based agenda, children have a right to be heard. And that's one of the ones I focus on a lot in my work. So it's about saying, if we consult children, if we ask them what they think, what will they say? And in my experience, they'll all say, actually, I really want to play in a puddle. I really want to climb that tree. I really want to lie under that tree. So when I go into environments, they say, oh, our children don't want to, I think sometimes it's about reframing the conversation and saying, have we consulted them? Do they feel empowered even to share their voice? Because when you truly listen to children, and that means we're not just listening to voice, but we're looking at behavior, then actually you begin to pick up these intuitive messages that the place where they're flourishing is the natural world, whatever that looks like in terms of your climate, your location, your curriculum, your community. That affects the way that the nature-based experience happens for children. But across the world, I think that children need the natural world. What we're beginning to realise now is actually when you look at inside your building, there are things we can do. Just the amount of plants in our environment, the biophilic design principles about the lighting, the colour, they're having an effect on children as soon as they walk in the door. Then you look at outside in terms of a landscape space, which is really should be designed in collaboration with the child and parent and family. And when you ask children, they'll say, I want a hill, I want a mud puddle, I want a shade, I want a tree. And then you go beyond the fence. And beyond the fence is, I suppose, what I would call nature on nature's terms. So it's untamed, it's unpredictable, it's spontaneous. And so unexpected wonders fly by. And as an adult in that space, you therefore have to have a pedagogical way of thinking that is intuitive, that is responsive, that allows you to respond in a kind of pedagogical dance to the things that children are giving you. When you look at a deeper meaning of that, one of the things I've been looking at in my doctoral work is the idea of inside as in inside spirit, outside in terms of our relationship to other, and then beyond in terms of our global society. And we know, because of all the reports that we now see, and we're aware of, which is a good thing, that actually the earth needs us to be a little bit more responsive. It's giving us very clear messages that something's not functioning for it. So therefore, what we need to be able to do is to say, as a global society, how do we create an educational pedagogy, a way of working with children that is fit for the 21st century, that is about sustainability, that is about relationship, both to the living and the non-living world. So we're really creating these environments that aren't conducive to human flourishing. So therefore, we're seeing a rise in trauma, a rise in stress. But you can't just change one part of that experience. It's got to be, I think, inside, outside, beyond in terms of a location, but also inside, outside, beyond in terms of a relationship. What I'm talking about is often when people talk about nature pedagogy, they think it's just going outside, whereas actually, if you look at all the models of access and engagement with the natural world around the world, so you could be in Sweden, be looking at Skogsmula. You could be in Norway looking at Barnehaga. You could be looking at a nature group. You could look at forest school. You could look at any of these models. But underneath all of them are these very similar principles, which I think are the ones that guide us in our pedagogy, the way that we work with children, and our philosophy, really. And so what we're finding, sadly, is that rather than seeing connections between all these different types of ways of working with children, we're developing silos. We're saying, well, I am this, which is lovely for identity, but as soon as you identify yourself as separate, you become something that defends their space. So it's I am this and I am not that. Whereas what we're trying to do is to have a collective conversation to say, I am this, and that's great. And somebody else says, I am this, and I am this, and this is my philosophy. But together, collectively, we can really start to look at a way of working with children which is more in tune with the natural world. One of the things I find quite interesting is this concept of reductionism. So we take the natural world and in all its variety and complexity, and we reduce it to a base point. So that means, for example, if you think about the colour yellow, we reduce that in our environments, both inside in terms of a plastic tray, outside in terms of some safety surface we put on our playgrounds, or beyond even in terms of the colour of crisp packet we choose. So we've reduced this beautiful colour, yellow, to a Pantone colour, which is a single one that is used in every single environment. So then reframe that and say to yourself, okay, what would happen if actually we brought in yellow roses? And we bring in a bunch of yellow roses and we put them in front of children. Well, first of all, they'll deconstruct them, they'll pull them apart. But then they start to look at the variety and complexity of the shade of yellow, about the fact that a rose petal goes from dark yellow to mid-yellow to white to even green. That's the stuff that really develops the higher order thinking. So I would actually suggest that when people say to me, I'm not sure about the cognitive benefits of the natural world, I would be arguing actually what you're doing in terms of providing a single Pantone colour is really basic. And what we're talking about in terms of nature pedagogy is higher order thinking. And your child will retain this information because they're motivated. The brain, the amygdala has been switched on, so therefore it's likely to move into long-term memory. Whereas this, which may not have any social connection or emotional connection to the child, is often explored, repeated, and then forgotten. You know, what works for us in Scotland and at Auchlone is our location. It's a location that's culturally placed. So most of early years are situated. They're placed in a society, in a community, as I said, in a climate, surrounded by a curriculum in various parts of the world. So therefore we are place-based in our philosophies. So what my centre looks like should be very different to one that's in Brazil and one that's in Africa or one that's in Canada, anywhere, because we connect through values and principles, but the way it is manifested should be different according to those few things like the climate and the curriculum and the community. So then for me, it's about bringing together the experiences that children have in the natural world, inside, outside, and beyond, but then being able to document the child's voice to then demonstrate that actually this is the learning that's taking place, making that learning visible in a way that isn't adult directed all the time, so that observations and conversations, that relationships come through. And so we use these big floor books, and the floor books for me are about 3 voices. So you're bringing through the child's voice as being the most dominant, you're bringing through the practitioner's voice because they're analysing what they're hearing, what they're saying, what they're observing, and then through doing that you're also involving the parent carer. Now that entwined journey, that learning journey as I would call it, then in some countries has to be tracked back and matched to curriculum outcomes. But the difference is that the child is leading the learning, and the curriculum is here, whereas in many models the curriculum is put to be the first thing and then children's voices come after. So it's about how you reframe your lens on that process to make sure that children are as far up that planning and documentation and assessment cycle as you can possibly take them. When you bring those two things together, so nature is now the context, it's the resource, it's the situation, it's the location for learning, and you combine it then with an effective documentation process, that's when I think it starts to sing. You know, if you think about it, can you imagine a child walking in and saying, oh, you know, this is my outcome for today, when they're 4 years old? And that's not what childhood's about. So for me, it needs to be something that holds on to the joy. You know, these words, joy, exuberance, spirit, the words that really represent the World Forum, they sometimes don't exist in environments. And so the fact that the World Forum are doing the Values Project, I think is a wonderful thing. And it's about how we can help people see that these are the values that actually we can all do collectively. And so I think, you know, when you look at most curricula, they're not aspirational. They're norm referenced, which means that they're the averages of everything. And so when you really know children and you find that they're in that place where this harmony is happening, then the pedagogical dance begins. So if this is the child and this is the adult, we meet. And when you really understand children and connect to children, this happens. And many people will say you can just feel it here. It's a thing that you feel. And then the lovely thing about dancing, obviously living in Scotland, we do lots of dancing, is the fact that sometimes the child is leading, sometimes the adult is leading. Sometimes we move quite quickly, sometimes we move very slowly. And it's that understanding of the pedagogical dance can have different steps in different places with different children, but that there is a relationship here. And I think sometimes in the natural world especially, people believe that it's a more dangerous place, it's a riskier place, it's a place of threat. And in some parts of the world that's true, where there are crocodiles and there are things that could kill you. But we've got so scared of the natural world that we actually don't engage with children in this pedagogical dance within the frame of the natural world. So then what happens is that actually the disconnect takes place. So the adult is only half attentive because half their brain is now thinking about safety, security, because they themselves are overly aware of the hazards. And so when this happens, well, the child's are now only getting 50%. In some cases, you find that the adult is purely perceiving themselves to be the supervisor, to be the observer, the controller, if you like. And so the child is here. And although we know that that empowerment for children works really well, there's a lot of research that says actually children benefit from co-construction with another. This idea of whether it's an adult is debatable, but I think with another human being, provocates language, provocates that curiosity that really will help that child develop those higher order thinking skills. A lot of people talk about physical risk, and it's the grazed knee, the bruise. But when you change the narrative and start talking about there being medallions of adventure, so we reframe that conversation to be one of adventure rather than being one of harm. Yeah, that's the first thing that happens. Second thing about risk is that actually there are many types of risk, and so we talk about physical risk, but imagine the emotional risk of children not being able to push themselves to their boundary, not being able to challenge themselves to, I suppose, go out and believe in themselves. That's an emotional risk. The social risk of reaching out to another human being in the fear of rejection because you want to make friends, there's a social risk in that. And then the other one is the intellectual risk. Well, nobody really ever does me a benefit risk assessment on monumentally boring programming. So, if you did, how many of us would have to stop our programs because they are just inappropriate? So for me, I keep talking to people about 4 types of risk. So let's get balance in that conversation and not just look at that physical stuff, because that's the one we can measure more easily than the other 3. I think if you're going to create an innovative pedagogy, if you're going to really raise this thing that I'm calling nature pedagogy, then what you have to then do is to say, why are you doing it? And I am intentional in my use of the word pedagogy, because what I'm finding is that it's the adults that make the decisions about children's access to going outside or to having any nature in the room, even a pot plant. They're also the ones that affect the time. How long do children have in contact with nature? They're the ones that design the space, and they're the ones that choose the resources. So for me, a lot of my work is around working to develop the skills, the concepts, the attitudes of the adult practitioner. What you're finding now, or what I'm finding now, sorry, is that those adults that are working with children are part of a generation, perhaps, that has suffered from what Richard Louv calls the nature deficit disorder. They themselves were indoor dwellers. And there's nothing wrong with being an indoor dweller, but it's therefore imbalanced their understanding of the place of the natural world in their programming. So for me, it's about taking those adults who work with children back to where they are and then walking alongside them. And sometimes it's in very small steps to be able to say to them, actually, these are some of the skills you might need to know. How much do we feel that we know about leaves? How much do we know about the names of things? Although that's not key to it, it is about that inner confidence. And if you've got an inner confidence as an adult, it actually means that you're more prepared to follow that pedagogical dance of children, because you're giving up some of the power, you're empowering children, so therefore you have to. I think one of the things we can learn as a global society is how much of this sits in First Nation, Indigenous, ancient wisdoms that have been there on the planet, but we have forgotten those, or we maybe don't value those. And so it's not about just replicating, but it's about understanding that there are people in the world who understand harmony, balance, about creating a way that humans really are just a small part of this larger ecosystem that is the wonderful planet Earth. Several things need to happen, I believe, to help us move forward. One is that we need to integrate nature-based pedagogies into undergraduate degrees, so that when you're getting any form of training, a certificate, a diploma, a degree, it doesn't really matter what level, the natural world is embedded in that space. And in order for that to happen, it needs to have an identity. And so therefore the identity is nature pedagogy, and therefore the next part of that is people say, well, it needs to have rigor, it needs to have definition. That's the PhD. So once you've done that, now we can say, actually, this is nature pedagogy and this is its definition. And when you do that, then you can go to governments, you can go to policymakers, you can go to people who are at university level and say, this is rigorous. It's not just a group of bright ideas, it has rigor, it has depth, it has philosophy, and it is peer reviewed. So those kinds of things, I think, move us forward globally in terms of the status of the natural world. When you have conversations with people, already people are going, oh, nature pedagogy? So the pedagogy as a word for some people in the world is a bit like, what? But it's growing momentum. So people are very aware of pedagogy as a thing. So when you tag nature pedagogy, then people go, oh, hold on, this is something that is different, this is something that is unique. But if my mother was here, she'd be saying, so you mean just like working with nature? And I would have to say, yeah, Mum, you're right, yeah. So yeah, a bit deeper than that, but pretty much, yeah, it's about...
That's
yeah.
exactly what I was thinking.